Very nice. I hadn't thought about the award-winning attribute, because that's a really good one to have, right, for all kinds of purposes. So yeah, thank you, Lee. Thank you, QuIRI, and thank you to all the familiar and soon to be familiar faces who showed up today. It's a treat to be here. And my goal today is, as Lee said, to talk a bit about the Digital Due Process Clinic and introduce you to this project. I hope you can all see my slides now. Yes, okay, that's perfect. Yes. There's two caveats that I want to start with. So the first one is that I'm more of a spokesperson today. Of course, there's a whole bunch of people who've been working on this project and supporting it, and I'm going to show them later on a slide today. And the second caveat is that while this is maybe an innovative project with regards to qualitative research, it's by far not the only one at Cornell. There is, we have a wonderful a community of people who work on many similar and related projects. Nathan Matthias in communication, for instance, there's folks in information science, Karen Levy, and STS, and many other areas. So this is what's nice about this, and also about QuIRI and about the award, is that this is really part of a bigger trend at Cornell. So that's what I wanted to say up front. The goal is, yeah, to introduce you and to welcome you to the Digital Due Process Clinic. And the clinic really started at the end of 2019. Originally, it was part of the broader impacts section of an NSF grant, and it still is part of this broader impact section. But this is how it came about, but it soon developed really a life of its own. And again, that was due to some ideas that I had, but also mainly ideas of my collaborators and the many students who worked with the clinic. So in a nutshell, the Digital Due Process Clinic is a clinical research program that brings together multidisciplinary teams of undergraduate students to engage in research, advocacy, and outreach on behalf of people who struggle with automated decision systems. This is the clinic in a nutshell. And today I want to do four things. Namely, first, I want to tell you a bit about the rationale and how the clinic came about, so the gap that it tries to fill. Two, I want to say a few words about this specific model of the clinic and clinical education, because that might be interesting to at least a few of you. Third, I want to show you three exemplary projects that we've been working on over the past 3 years. These are qualitative research projects. And then four, I want to outline a few challenges, a few good challenges that we've encountered, specifically with regard to doing qualitative research in a large group of people, because after all, this is QuIRI, and this is, I guess, what we are all interested in. Okay, so where did the clinic come from? There is a popular image of the proliferation of scores and scoring system in our lives, and this stock photo that you see now is one of them. So it's a person that's associated with a score, and that's been perpetuated by a range of popular representation. I think many of you have seen maybe the Black Mirror episode Nosedive. You might know science fiction literature, Cory Doctorow, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is all about wuffies, a score that people have. Wired magazine covers of the upper body of a person with this little sign here that says, hello, my score is 738. And even reporting, or I should say sensationalist reporting actually, about the Chinese social credit system, which comes with this dystopia of a single score that's attached to every person and follows them through their lives. This is the common, I guess, the popular image of a scored society, really. But there's two things that are problematic with this, namely one, that it is a single score that people have, and two, that it's a dystopia, really, that is far away or happens in some really problematic techno-orientalist way in, well, countries like China or at the other end of the world. In fact, it's happening right here, because when you start searching for stores and storing systems that we are subject to in our everyday lives, you come across a whole range of companies, some of which you might have heard of, some of which you might not have heard of. All these companies and providers produce in one way or another computationally generated scores, metrics, rankings, ratings, reports that have an immediate impact on your life chances. So applying for a mortgage, looking for a date on a dating website, applying to rent an apartment, buying a book on Amazon, signing up for health insurance, waiting to be scheduled for a complicated surgery, selling yoga mats online, applying for a job, applying to college. In all these cases, there's a plethora of stores and scoring systems that judge you in ways that are quite consequential and in ways that supplement, or in some cases even substitute official decision-making. So of course, the promise that comes with this ecology of stores and scoring systems, these automated decision systems, comes with a lot of promises about efficiency, speed, accuracy, and better decision-making. But of course, we know from a lot of research, also a lot of research that's happening in Cornell in communication, IS, STS, sociology, and many other areas, that there's a lot of problems with this, right? So people have talked about problems with fairness, discrimination, and bias in these systems. People have written and talked a lot about the opacity of these stores and computational devices and the challenge of understanding them in practice. And all of these challenges really bring up one question that we decided to focus on in this clinic, that were also part of the original research project the clinic was integrated in. Namely, what can you do if you feel misrepresented by an automated system, right? What if the store comes up with a judgment about you? What if the computer system comes up with a judgment about you that you might not agree with and you think is wrong or complicated in a particular way? And this is something that's actually really interesting, because most of the research, I should say, has actually focused on the system. So has been strangely focused on technology. So people have been trying to diagnose bias in these systems, audit these systems, right? Think about software engineers and experts and how they do in these systems, but how people on a daily basis cope with, experience, and deal with some of these decisions, these automated decisions and judgments. That's only, I think, that only is being researched as we speak now. So that has been a little gap. So as a good American citizen, which many of you are, and I'm not, or maybe not yet, you know that when it comes to recourse against an official decision, then one of the big principles, at least in the United States constitutionally, but also colloquially and popularly, is the principle of due process, right? It's a broad legal principle that prohibits arbitrary deprivation of life, liberty, or property by the government, except as authorized by the law. Legally, it's actually a really interesting and complex principle. It's not a single principle. It's mentioned in the 5th and 14th Amendment, and it's been mainly designed and developed through case laws, through Supreme Court cases. There is a lot that you could say about legal due process, but the bottom line is that one of the main ideas is that arbitrary and inaccurate outcomes of an official process must be subject to some kind of review, to expert review. This is the idea of the process that is due when you're affected in your rights and freedoms by an official decision. But of course, obviously, this has been developed for the legal system, right? So what happens when we take this principle now and put it into a data-driven world? And so, oh, by the way, I should say the person here, you might be wondering who this guy is. This is Clarence Earl Thomas. He was the subject of one of the guiding Supreme Court cases on due process. He was accused, I think in 1961, of petty larceny and wanted to defend himself in a court of law, was denied legal counsel, and then was convicted by a jury and sent to prison. And he managed to bring his case in front of the Supreme Court, where he then fought for a right to have a legal counsel, even if you cannot afford one. So to help you against decisions that might affect your life. So yeah, this is Clarence Earl did in a photo of him. And it's a standard case that law students actually are probably very familiar with, because it's one of the first ones they mentioned. Okay, but what happens if we take now this idea of due process and put it into a data-driven world? And there's people who've done quite some research on this, right? And the problems you encounter is, first of all, well, in contrast to legal decision, these computationally generated judgments are really hard to figure out, right? So it's often not clear that actually one of those judgments was involved in something that affects you. And one of the main reasons is that many of these systems are actually designed to operate obliquely, right? So they're designed to operate without you knowing that you're being tracked and traced, in order for data to be collected on the basis of which you are then stored, right? So you're exactly not to interfere with this process. So that's one problem. Another problem is that legal recourse, so traditional legal recourse, is really limited in these settings. Part of it, part of the reason is that the decisions that the judgments you're affected by are actually not state judgments or legal government judgments, but they come from third parties or private companies that generate these judgments. So many of the traditional legal provision against, let's say, a police action or administrative law do not hold. There's an imbalance of expertise, of course. In order to challenge your computational judgments, you probably need to know something about how the system works, or you need to be a computer scientist, an engineer. At least that's been the focus in recent work. And of course, there's a lack of resources, right? Because if a very rich person has been affected by a computationally generated judgment and they're not happy with that, let's say the president of the universities of California is unhappy with how the Berkeley University is represented in the wake of a pepper spray incident against students, they can hire a PR firm, an optimization firm, and clean up Google search results. So one form of automated judgment about you. So what happens when you type in UC Berkeley into Google? And you do not want these pepper spray photos to show up, then you can hire an expensive firm and get rid of it. But that's something that most people in their lives cannot do, because it's just too expensive. So to cut a long story short, this is the really cheesy analogy that we came up with to justify what we are doing. So when you think about the legal system, there are certain judgments that are made under the law, court decisions, police actions, administrative acts. There are certain challenges of challenging these judgments, namely the legal system, it's complex, opaque, and inscrutable. And so in order for you to have effective recourse and due process, you need some form of professional legal representation, right? And these are lawyers, public defenders, which help you when you're not, when you can't afford one, pro bono lawyers, and so on. So with computer systems, it's actually really interesting, because you might not encounter a court decision, but you might encounter a score, a metric, a rating, and ranking. And similar to the legal system, this system is complex, opaque, and inscrutable, right? But the big problem is there's no really parallel recourse or professional representation that you might have, right? There's no public defender system for automated scores and judgment. So this is then the idea where not due process jumps in, but digital due process. And this is why I said it was cheesy, because it might be too easy, but it's an analogy that has worked quite well in explaining some of these ideas to people and to what we're doing. And this is then in this gap down there, this is then where the digital due process clinic intervenes. It's about rethinking the idea of due process in data-driven worlds from the margins. And there's three core questions that we have been asking ourselves. Namely, one, how do ordinary people experience and make sense of automated judgments? Ordinary here, not in the sense of in a dismissive sense, but ordinary in the sense of non-experts. What kinds of recourse and resistance do exist, and how effective are they? And what can be done to improve their situation? And this is the rationale for the clinic and how it came about. And by the way, if anyone has questions, of course, you can, I don't see you, but you can shout or stream into your microphones, and then I'm happy to address them. So this is how the Digital Due Process Clinic came about, and you're welcome to visit the website. We have a modest website under the address down there. So the second element then is this question of clinic and clinical education, and why clinical education. And this is an area in which we also took some inspiration from law schools, right? Because at law schools, and especially at Cornell Law School, there's a long history of clinical legal education that actually emerged in the 1970s during the civil rights era, when people were challenging traditional legal education at US law schools as classroom-based, doctrinal, focused on case books and reciting cases, and where people said, actually, you folks in these law schools, you need to go out and help people as you are learning the law and doing your education. So the key idea here of this movement towards clinical legal education was to place students in professional roles as students, as an essential part of legal education. And this was premised on the idea that adults learn best when they have direct responsibility for a case. And so this started a movement of legal clinical education. And I'm happy to report that Cornell University Law School was one of the first to institute a legal aid office. There's a long tradition of these clinics at the law school today. And I encourage you to maybe have a look at the law school website. You can see the whole range of clinics there. So, but the key idea is a sense of learning by doing, right? That you place students in a position of responsibility and let them work. By the way, this is just an aside really, but I briefly wanted to mention this. There's a similar movement these days with regard to technology, in the same way in the 1970s that people were trying to move from law to public interest law. These days, there's a move of many people and foundations from technology to public interest technology. There's actually a whole bunch of initiatives. Again, they are pushed and funded by big foundations. In the 1970s, for public interest law, it was the Ford Foundation that was very instrumental in that process. Today, it's again the Ford Foundation and New America and others who who are contributing to this push to public interest technology. And again, there's a whole bunch of people at Cornell who work in that space, and there's a number of initiatives to draw these together, which is a different topic, but we can talk about this maybe later. Anyway, so the idea of clinical education is to really cultivate responsibility. And this is then what we do in the Digital Due Process Clinic. Undergraduate students work in multidisciplinary teams on specific projects and cases. They're supervised by faculty. And as one of the amazing gimmicks, we even have this business card, which was a really good investment. So it's 25 bucks, I think. You can make them for your group. And for students, actually, it turned out, I think none of the students are here today because they have a class, unfortunately, right now. But it gives you an identity, right? So it's this marker of taking responsibility and representing something and learning as you're doing that. So this is basically the idea of clinical education, and we have 3 long-term goals. So first of all, there's research, learn about the problem of recourse against computationally generated judgments. In its social, cultural, historical context, there's advocacy to work and support people who feel mistreated by these systems. And then there's outreach, right? Sharing findings with non-academic audiences. I'm afraid to say that Corona has been, of course, COVID has been a bit of a challenge with regard to the advocacy part, because actually reaching out and working with people off campus has been a bit of a challenge. So in the first 2 years, we've mainly been focusing on more traditional research projects and the outreach part in order to learn about the problem. But to work on actual cases and to take more on and to take on the role of actually a representative of people affected by these systems, this is the next step. And I'm always happy for ideas and thoughts on how to do this. So 3 exemplary projects that we've been working on over the past 2 years. So the first one I wanted to mention is one that we've called Storing Struggles. This was actually the first project we started with the first cohort. And despite being the guinea pigs, those folks have done an amazing job. This was the spring semester in which COVID hit. So we had to rearrange a lot of things on short notice. But basically the idea was to look at how people deal with a problem that they are misrepresented in Google search results, right? So there's a whole bunch of groups and communities who are struggling with this. And in this case, I'm starting in the middle now on the right-hand side. We focused on 4 groups of people that we wanted to interview and learn more about in the Ithaca area, namely 1, small business owners, who became into who got into the crossfires of search wars. For instance, there's the Mockingbird paper shop downtown, right? That at one point sold anti-Trump postcards. So they got into big trouble because at some point when you were searching for Mockingbird papery on Google, you got a lot of negative reviews and slander and these kinds of things because they were then targeted by pro-Trump activists. We focused on recently incarcerated people, so people who were released from prison and who clearly might have a challenge with searching for jobs when an employer Googles their name. So there's a lot of stuff that comes up that from their past crimes. We focus on candidates for public office, people who run for, I don't know, local attorney or for local political office, and how those people deal with their representation in search results. And then we were looking at one particular case of competing service providers, especially in Ithaca, this case of Planned Parenthood offering abortion services, broadly speaking, downtown, and then the pregnancy clinic 2 blocks down the road that is targeting the same group of women mostly, but is offering not abortion service, but general pregnancy counseling with a very different political, of course, agenda. And so those 2 organizations are having a hell of a fight in Google search results over search terms like abortion, Ithaca, for instance. And so that's another one. That was another political struggle. Anyway, so what we did is we conducted semi-structured interviews with people from these 4 groups. And the goal was to capture the everyday experience of being ranked and having to deal with forces and forms of automated judgments, which a search engine results page in this context is, and how they dealt with it. So this resulted in a report on storing struggles. We have a working paper on the website. It's currently being revised for publications. And a few folks are working on follow-up project that has the working title Humans of AI, analogous to Humans of New York, which basically features one story of one person struggling with an automated decision on a blog, basically. There's a lot of challenges with that because the photos are not as easy to do as the Humans of New York folks, but there's something about data, subject, stories, and sharing those to a wider audience. That's one example, the first project. The second project that we started this spring, also affected by COVID, of course, was to look at the ecology of stores and storing systems. You probably can't see what's on the slide, but it's mainly supposed to indicate all the stores and storing systems that come into play when you're trying to do certain things in your life. So there's a person in the middle in this very simple visualization. Then there are certain things they want to do in the next circle around them, like get a job offer, get into college, buy a book, buy an airplane ticket, be released on parole, and so on. And then what we did is we assembled a data set of 156 stores and storing systems, which is pretty substantial, and basically mapping all the stores and storing systems that affect the decisions that are made for these life chances. Because usually there's the idea you have a single store. Remember this initial popular image, but actually it turns out that even if you're trying to get a mortgage, there is 5, 6, 7, 8 different stores from different providers and so on. So it's to get a sense of the ecology of stores and storing systems and make this explorable to people who are not experts in this field, because it is very complex. There's 3 analytic themes that came out of this work. One is this really difficult challenge of understanding the hinterland of these systems. So understand the ways that they exchange and share data among each other, the way their models for storing people travel from credit storing to assessing applicants for apartment rentals to health insurance storing to determine what rate you're paying for your insurance. And so there's interesting connections between all these areas. And this is something that we've been trying to map. There's also interesting aspects, of course, about, again, awareness and accessibility in the forms of recourse. So what we're doing here, with help from someone who's also worked with the Milstein program at Cornell, namely a design visualization person from New York City, Irvin Chen, is to build a store, an interactive store explorer, right? So a website that allows you to see what stores affect decisions that affect you in certain areas of life. So it's sort of a game of life for stores, basically. And it's an attempt to turn a qualitative data set into an interactive experience, which is a big challenge. And maybe it doesn't work, but it's one of the things that we are trying to do in this case. And finally, the third project is a smaller one and a more experimental one. This takes on a really particular phenomenon. That's what two students worked on over the summer, namely the phenomenon of educational stores, specifically in consumer credit storing, right? So as you know, you have many credit stores that affect your lives, again, for mortgage and jobs and many other things. And you do not really know what your actual scores are because they are not shared with you. They're shared between the credit bureaus, the scoring providers, and the people who make decisions about how trustworthy or creditworthy you are. But there's recently been this phenomenon of educational stores to give consumers like you and me something so they can experience what the store is like. And one of the devices that is part of this marketing initiative over the past 15 years are credit store simulators. So it's basically a simulator you can log on, it shows you a store, and then you can see, oh, what happens if I change my credit utilization, right? What happens if I get an additional credit card? Will my score rise or fall, right? And so it's a really interesting artifact, and there's quite a few of them, and they've become important in marketing. So we've been skeptical of these credit store simulators because the basic idea is that these simulators, well, do not really simulate a store, but they simulate a world in which storing has its place, right? So they come with a whole bunch of assumptions about why a store is important. They suggest that you have some influence on it. You can actually change things if you change your life. They moralize behavior, especially financial behavior. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a bad person in financial terms, and so on? And what we've been doing is, one, we have been trying to take apart this simulated world through textual analysis of 5 existing credit store simulators. So basically we were taking the screenshots of these simulators, and it's super fascinating about how the text and the visuals are organized so as to enact a certain world and get a certain idea of what storing is. We did something that was very new to me, but that I think people have been trying in different areas of qualitative research. We have, thanks to one undergraduate student, Mike Tyrell, who is very savvy with these things, we have had a look at the data flows and code behind the tool, right? So things that you cannot usually see, and then try to trace back which interfaces many of these storing simulators query with what other credit bureaus and companies. There's certain things you can see with that. So that's been really interesting experience. And then the other part that we did here is try to rethink the credit store simulator and engage in something that Mike Mulcahy, an STS researcher, called analytic parody. So it's the idea of turning a methodology upon itself. And so what we did is we identified alternative storing factors, namely all the things you cannot change in your life and that actually affect your credit score, like the zip code you grew up in, right? Your gender, your ethnicity, whether it's a recession or not. So all these things you cannot control, and put those into something we call a credit score dissimulator. So it's a completely abstruse thing, because it says, yeah, if you want to increase your score, well, see what happens when you change your gender, right? Or try to move to a different zip code and enter a different zip code and see what happens. So it's a way of trying to make visible the hidden assumptions and the many alternative scoring factors that you do not see with the traditional public educational scores, and that's also very close to being prototyped. Anyway, so these are 3 projects: the scoring struggles, the experience of people with search results pages, the more holistic view on the ecology of scores and scoring systems, and then this design intervention of building a credit score simulator that is actually a credit score dissimulator, right? That shows you the factors that actually are relevant. And yeah, there's a whole world there. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention is some good challenges to have in this work, and especially something that was new to me, and I know that a lot of people are thinking about at Cornell, but also elsewhere, namely how to combine research with teaching, especially qualitative research, and how to work in larger teams of undergraduate students on these projects. A general challenge is the first one I mentioned here, and this is the counter-normativity in service learning. I love this concept so much that I quoted it literally from a paper that I learned from our colleagues at Engaged Cornell. The paper was written by a scholar by the name of Jeffrey Howard, and it's basically the idea that learning at the university comes with a certain normativity, right? Namely that the teacher gives you the readings and tells you what to read, what's important in the field. It's the idea that there's a highly structured process to which you have to run, and at the end you get a grade. This is clearly very different in these projects, right? Because we're doing some of the literature review at least together. So one of the tasks for students is actually to identify the most relevant readings to our project. And this can be very, very helpful and useful, but it is very different from what students are used to in a lot of other classes. So an ongoing challenge is to push against this idea of being told what to do and of consuming knowledge, and moving on to, again, taking responsibility for your case and the people you're working with yourself. Other issues that might not be surprising are training needs when you're doing this kind of research in the context of what usually is a class. There is a lot of startup costs, so everybody has to undergo IRB training. There is ethical training that you need. Interviewing is a big art that is really hard to teach in a short amount of time. It's also a risky endeavor, as we know from engaging with the world. There are methods workshops that we've done. And so one of the challenges has been how to most elegantly and most instructively deal with the need to bring students up to speed to actually do this work. It's worked very well, but there is a certain art to it, which I haven't really figured out. And so that's an interesting challenge. There's also challenges to research organization. Well, first of all, a common challenge in engaged research, the seasonality of our semesters. So mid-May, everybody's gone, but your research participants are still there, right? And they still call and they still have questions or might follow up. And of course, you want to work with them. So there's challenges that we've been working with in that regard by having now a summer fellowship program for undergraduate students to continue to work on these projects. But it is tricky because it can quickly get out of hand and basically become a shadow operation within a university, which is of course not the goal. Team communication is also tricky. It's nice to split up work into different teams and groups, but then bringing them together again and not just having a talk back in a big classroom after pair, discuss and share, or whatever that popular mechanism is called again. I forgot the phrase, but you really have to be on top of what everybody's doing. So sharing these things back are difficult, and authorship and credit are also, of course, an interesting challenge that is not specific now to the clinic, but that a lot of people in STS, Marc Slieber-Wrong, for instance, who has a laboratory, have been thinking about a lot, and there's some growing literature. And then the last two parts are about collectivizing about collectivizing methods. So interviewing in teams is something that is required by Cornell University Council and the wonderful people in risk assessment at Cornell. So you interview in teams and don't do it alone. So what does it mean for conducting an interview, right? How can you split up the work? What does it mean? How do you organize yourself? That's an interesting challenge that we've encountered both on Zoom and in person. Data sessions, how do you analyze data with a group of, well, up to 20 people, right? Does everybody code the same interviews? What software would actually allow us to do that? And what startup costs are in learning that? And what are alternatives to doing that? That's something I'm interested in if people have ideas about it. And then how do you theorize in a big group of people, something that's considered very intimate and personal and individual endeavor, at least in the fields that I've been working in sociology and especially history and also anthropology. So how do you do it in a group of people? And then finally, and this comes with the outreach and partly with the advocacy part, how do you present your research, right? So we've been thinking about this a lot. We started with a conventional public-facing research report, which is an interesting genre in its own right, and one that we have to learn and think hard about how to do this for what audience. But then also, what are some alternative forms of presenting that data, right? What about visualizations, interactive tools like the credit score simulator? Could that be a way of getting out research to a broader audience with a different mission? What about this store explorer? Is that something that's useful when you allow people to play with this data set of stores and storing systems? Is it something that will help people or not? And how do you do it in a way? That's something we're not trained in as qualitative researchers. Well, at least I was not trained in that. It's not a very common form of scholarly expression and communication. And that's also something that's been one of the most amazing challenges, to see what can be done, to see what other people are doing in other disciplines in terms of presenting their data, especially qualitative data. Is always a challenge. And yeah, what are some good ways of doing this? So I think I should stop here. These are the collaborators and supporters I want to mention. There's a whole bunch of people. Some of those folks you might look familiar to you. And of course, there's a lot of individuals who've been instrumental in doing this work. Ranjit Singh, a former graduate student who now works at Data and Society, is very, very important. The folks that engaged Cornell, and a whole lot of other people. And also Bruce, who I see is here, the former chair of our department, has been very supportive with making this possible within the context of the department, which is not a given, by the way. This is actually a challenge that many other people have encountered. And this is something that, of course, we're grateful for. So thank you. I hope this was useful to some extent, and I'm happy to talk about any aspect or issues that you might have encountered, maybe in your own work.